everyone. This week we are going to talk about the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Now, last week we made it through all of what are called the historical books. That was Joshua through Esther, and this week we are getting into what is known as the wisdom literature. And this includes Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So we have a little bit smaller section to deal with today, which I'm sure you are all happy about. Last week's reading and even the week before that was probably pretty difficult and pretty intense. Now, Psalms is still a very long book, but it's probably easier for you to read than are the historical books. So hopefully you had a little bit easier time, or are going to have a little bit easier time with your Bible reading this week. We're also a lot more familiar with at least Psalms and Proverbs than we are with some of the other historical books, so maybe some of it will sound familiar to you. Job, the first of these books, is about a man named Job, not Job, who is a righteous man. He loves God. He lives rightly before God, and he's also been blessed by God materially. Now, when we say that somebody's been blessed by God, that doesn't always mean that they're blessed materially. But Job is. He has a big family. He's wealthy. He has a well-established business in terms of agriculture, and it seems like he has a good life, a great life. Satan, the devil, decides that Job has been too blessed, that Job's righteousness is only because of his material wealth, and goes to God and says, look, you know what? I don't think Job is actually a righteous man. I think he just blesses you and loves you, God, because you've given him so much. You've blessed him in so many ways. And so God gives permission to Satan, for Satan to then go and test Job. So what happens in chapters 1 and 2 is what we just went over, that Satan goes to God, asks permission to test Job, and God gives him permission and says, Job's not going to curse me. Job is going to stand up to your test, Satan, and Job is going to prove himself to be a righteous man. Satan then goes and tests Job, and long story short, everything that Job has is taken away from him, whether through death or destruction. Job's family dies, except for his wife, who eventually does. And then his sons and daughters die, his livestock, his crops are destroyed. So Job loses the things that God has given him as material blessings. And Job's wife counsels Job to curse God and die. Job refuses. Job's friends give him very bad advice. They also encourage Job not to trust in the Lord, but to recognize that God must be mad at him, that Job must have done something wrong for God to do this to him, and to basically say wrong things about who God is and how he treats us. And Job withstands his wife's attempts to have him curse God and die, and for the most part, he withstands his friends' bad advice. Elihu also gives a monologue, and again, Job stands firm in his beliefs about God until finally Yahweh, God himself, speaks from the whirlwind. And it's towards the end of Job's friends trying to sway him, and in between that and Elihu's monologue, that Job finally does begin to question, well, why am I suffering? What did I do? And, whoops, sorry about that. Job Job finally gets an answer from God, but the answer isn't one that we ever like. Because the answer that Job gets from God is that um, God is in control. God's ways are not our ways. Um, we cannot understand God fully, and the things that happen to us and that happen in this world sometimes are not explainable. We just have to trust that God is God and we are not. And that's a difficult thing to come to grips with. God doesn't tell Job about Satan's request. Um, God doesn't give Job an answer other than, I am God. And that's a difficult answer to try to assimilate into our thinking. You know, in the Western world especially, we are so prone to wanting specific answers to specific questions. We want to know why about everything. And God doesn't tell Job why. God says, Job, I love you, but I am God, and you are not. You cannot understand my ways. You cannot understand everything that I do. And the comfort comes when God says, but I am God. I am in control. This isn't random. It's not chaos. And it's not divine karma. I am in control, Job, and you need to trust me. So God doesn't just say, get over it. He says, trust me. I know that you're suffering, Job. I know that this has been painful, but I am God, and I know what to do in this world, even though you cannot understand it. Okay, so that ends with Job praising God, him recognizing who he is before God, him bowing down and worshiping God. And that's the story. It's not the story is oftentimes portrayed as we need to suffer like Job. We need to be patient like Job. And that's true. Job is a fairly good example for us. But the main point of the book is about God and about how God is in control of the world and we are not, and we have to trust him in that. Okay, so that's Job. The book of Psalms, then, many of you are probably familiar with the book of Psalms, as even if you didn't grow up in church, Psalms is still a huge part of Western culture. The book of Psalms is a series of short hymns, short with the exception of Psalm 119, of short hymns written about various things concerning God and his people. Oftentimes, these psalms are written from the perspective of suffering Israel. And what that means is many of these psalms are written, it appears, during the time of exile, which we talked about last week. And so these are psalms that are crying out to God, saying, God, when are you gonna save us? When are you coming back? When are we going to return from exile? There are also psalms, though, that in the midst of exile, in the midst of this lament, is what that's called, there are also psalms that portray the writers as hoping for salvation. Okay, so it's not just lament or frustration. It's also hope and praise. And that's sort of the alternating message of the Psalms, is that, you know, the two big messages here are, God, we're in exile. We know we're in exile, and oftentimes we know why we're in exile. We know that we've sinned. We know that we've turned away from you, God, but we're asking for you to bring us back. We desire for you to stand by the promises that you've made to us. Even though we know we've sinned, even though we know we've turned from you, would you please save us? Would you please restore us to yourself? And then that message, that lament, is coupled with a hope. And it's specifically a hope in a particular person. You'll notice Psalm 1 and 2 when you first read through the book of Psalms. Psalm 1 and 2 set the tone for the entire book. Psalm 1 talks about blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and etc., who is like a tree planted beside um, still waters, that sort of thing. This blessed man who is wise, who walks in the way of the Lord. And this man is portrayed in a garden. He's walking with God. He chooses good. He is like a tree planted beside the waters, etc. And this is a man who looks like Adam before the fall. Adam was supposed to be wise. He was supposed to walk with God. He was supposed to be in a garden, and he was supposed to subdue his enemies. And um, Adam obviously didn't do that. But now Psalm 1 is portraying this man who is doing what Adam didn't do, which is very interesting. It's also very interesting, especially when it's coupled with Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is clearly a messianic psalm talking about the Messiah. In other words, it's talking about the person who's going to come and save Israel from their sins. It's talking about the person who's going to come and save the world from their sins, who is going to restore the reign of God to the earth. And it's language that is talking about the Messiah, talking about Jesus. And Psalm 2 talks about how God is going to, through his Son, rule over the earth. He's going to subdue his enemies. He's going to actually conquer the enemies of God. And so when we put this blessed man together with this man who, God's Son, who is going to conquer the world, we have a picture of the Messiah. The Messiah is this man who is wise before God. The Messiah is also God's Son. He is God who's going to conquer his enemies. And so what we're looking for, the hope that we talked about just a few minutes ago, is hope in this God-man, this Messiah, this man who's going to come down as God and restore God's creation to what it should have been before Adam fell. And so we don't need to divorce this lament and hope language from where we find hope, which in Psalm 1 and 2, we find hope in the Messiah. And the Messiah is the wise man who walks with the Lord, something that Israel didn't do, and the whole reason they're in exile. And he's also somebody who conquers Israel's enemies, also something that Israel did not do. So this Messiah in Psalm 1 and 2 is the person that we're looking for, that Israel is hoping for throughout the book of Psalms. And you see that Psalms is probably divided into 5 books. It's disputed, but it appears that the outline occurs in 5 books. And these books generally alternate between lament and hope. Now, some of these books are more prone to deal with hope. Some of them are more prone to deal with lament. For instance, Book 5, especially the end of Book 5, is especially dealing with praise, and praise that God is going to save Israel. Praise that there is hope. But in general, each of these alternates between lament and hope. So, Psalms are called the hymn book of the church. Psalms are called a model for our relationship with God. And I suppose that's true. The Psalms do help us in our relationship with God. We can pray the Psalms. But in general, we don't need to individualize the Psalms. The Psalms are messages to God about sorrow over what has happened, petitioning God for salvation, and then hoping in the salvation that Israel knows will come. And we know that salvation has come in Jesus Christ. So as you read the Psalms, be careful not to individualize them. Now, they are prayers for us. Scripture applies to us individually. But they are largely about the sorrow over sin and the hope that comes through the Messiah.